So I wanted to record kind of giving you an overview of the Cold War. So this will go pretty quickly. A lot of the videos that I shared with you regarding kind of the Cold War inquiry will make sense, but I do want to kind of revisit this idea that, excuse me, that my hair's all weird. Okay, there we go. That when you come out of World War II, so the U.S. had this relationship with the Soviet Union, and the relationship had been pretty productive during World War II. Now, a lot of that has to do with the fact that we had a common enemy, that FDR was pretty cagey, Stalin's pretty cagey, like they seemed to kind of rub along okay. And also, the U.S. was giving the Soviet Union a lot of stuff, right? We were giving them lots of material, lots of equipment. It's when the war's wrapping up and Truman takes over. Truman's not FDR. He's a lot more skeptical. He just doesn't. He's just very straightforward. He's just not that kind of politically savvy guy that FDR was. And so you have Truman and Stalin not hitting it off. And a big part of the problem is that as the Nazis are defeated and we don't have that common enemy anymore, the Soviets don't really see a reason, Stalin in particular, doesn't see a reason to go out on a limb. So he's not fulfilling his promises to join the conflict with Japan. He's not letting free elections happen. I think that one kind of Cold War channel that is part of the resources that I shared with you has a lot to say. They have a whole like 10-minute video that talks about Stalin's behavior in Eastern Europe, as we're wrapping up the war in May, in June, and July of 1945. So he's not being a very good guy, right? And we shouldn't be surprised. I mean, he was a totalitarian dictator in the 1930s. He was doing those things anyways. I don't know that there's any reason to be shocked at Stalin's behavior. But what begins to happen is that very quickly this division of Germany becomes a huge part of this problem. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do. This is the one I want. Sorry, wrong screen here. The division of Germany is a big part of this, right? And so they had come to this agreement actually in the Yalta Conference. So I think I've mentioned this before, that it's at the Yalta Conference that you start to have some of these divisions taking place. So Yalta is where they initially decide on this division. That gets reaffirmed at Potsdam. And so you start to have not only a divided Germany, but also a divided Berlin. And people are escaping from East Berlin into West Berlin and then into West Germany. You have frustrations. The Soviets want bigger reparation payments from Germany. And we're trying to prevent another Treaty of Versailles situation. And so we're kind of refusing that. And you really start to have the American, British, and French zones operating very much as one kind of situation, as one kind of entity, really, and that will eventually become permanent. So this causes the Berlin blockade, and that triggers the Berlin airlift. So this is kind of where you see that taking place. The Truman Doctrine, 1947, has directly to do with Turkey and Greece and the Soviets not wanting to, the Soviets encouraging communist takeovers, and the U.S. saying, oh no, we can't let communism spread. So you start to have this commitment by the United States to promote kind of assistance to democratic nations. So this is the beginning of kind of that global engagement. So political, military, economic assistance begins in 1947. Followed by the Marshall Plan, which is a major economic stimulus to Europe, making it so that you're less likely to become communist if there's money to help stimulate capitalism, right? So that becomes a big part of it. Because it's post-World War II, our answer to everything is a partition. So just like it was partitioning up Berlin, partitioning up Germany, we're going to be partitioning up Korea. The Berlin airlift, of course, takes place from 1948 to 49. So that kind of eases tensions. Stalin backs away. Stalin will die a couple years after this airlift is over. And things will kind of settle into this tense period. Now, of course, the testing of nuclear weapons by the Soviets, that's going to trigger the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the Warsaw Pact. which are kind of countries aligned with the Soviet Union. This is, this notion of the Iron Curtain kind of begins about this time in the late 40s, where Churchill says, hey, there's this curtain dividing Europe. And so NATO becomes a part of that response. It's into this that you have Sputnik being launched in 1957. That's going to trigger the space race and kind of those tensions that are happening. The Sputnik will trigger the National Defense of Education Act. And massive investment in education. And so that kind of gets you largely through the 1950s as far as the Cold War. Now, I haven't really talked about the Korean conflict. There's some videos in the Inquiry that specifically talk about Korea. And I haven't really talked specifically about McCarthyism. There's some videos in the Inquiry that talk about McCarthyism. But understand within this context from the 1940s to the 1950s, you have things like the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan. You have NATO. You do have this Korean conflict, which largely comes about. There's a whole connection with China. China falls to communism around 1948, 49, depending on what year you're talking about. There's a refusal by the United States to allow China, the mainland China, to have the Taiwanese, what we now call the Taiwanese seat in the Security Council. And that's part of how you end up with the Korean conflict, right? Because it's a United Nations police action. It's not necessarily that it's strictly based on the United States. But part of how that happens is because, we refuse to recognize China and the communists and the Soviets get mad and they boycott. And so it's just a whole big mess. And so the U.S., you have this battle in Korea. I'm really giving short shrift to the Korean conflict. There's a whole lot more to that. The U.S. kind of has some success. And then that we push the North Koreans out of South Korea, and MacArthur wants to go into China. The Chinese overreact. They send troops in. They push us all the way back. We, back and forth. The winter there was pretty awful. Incheon Valley was pretty terrible. So there's some, if you're into military history, there's some good military history stuff from the Korean conflict. Just know that it ends in this stalemate, right? It ends with a demilitarized zone and a partition. And so you have that taking place with the Korean conflict. And that kind of simmers things down. Now, you do start to have, and we'll touch on this more here momentarily, beginning awareness about the Vietnam, and you start to have this notion of not letting countries fall to communism goes from kind of this Truman Doctrine containment, we're going to keep communism contained, into what we now call as the domino theory. If we let one country fall, another country will fall. And so you start to have this movement that allows for the United States to then get increasingly engaged in Vietnam, because we can't let Vietnam fall to communism, right? So it's not just about containing it, which is what we saw with the Truman Doctrine and aid to Turkey and Greece, but it also becomes about not letting countries fall. And it's into this context that the Soviet Union then develops nuclear weapons. We have the nuclear arms race. Sputnik, we have, bomb shelters and duck and cover and all this. And this is all happening at the same time that we're having the baby boom and the prosperity and all this kind of stuff. So it's an interesting juxtaposition. Part of the questioning about conformity during this period, we talked about kind of the social pressure to conform in the 1950s. Has to do with McCarthyism and this fear that somehow communism has infiltrated the United States, and we should be very concerned about that. So there's lots of ways in which this kind of has an impact on American society, and so I think it's worth kind of noting that. So I'll kind of pause here, and then that kind of gets you through the 1950s. We'll pick up in the 60s and start talking about Vietnam, and then maybe Nixon. We'll see how that goes.